Hey guys, Loam02. I'm going to be covering an archetype that actually I played a lot of, but have not put a lot of VODs up on for the Canadian Highlander format. So Canadian Highlander is a 100-card singleton format that has no banned list with the exception of a few cards to include manual dexterity cards like Falling Star, Chaos Orb, and a few weird, very old cards like Scheherazade where you restart the game a bunch of times. Otherwise, it's governed by a points list, which restricts the use of the most powerful cards en masse, so you're only capable of using certain powerful cards per each deck build. The deck you have in front of you is Death Taxes / it's basically White Weenie, Death and Taxes. The distinguishing mark I think between Death and Taxes and White Weenie is a pure aggressive deck, and Death and Taxes is more of an aggro control deck that utilizes counter spells that attack, i.e. cards like, Containment Priest, which, stops certain things, even Mind Sensor, Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, etc., to kind of just randomly beat down your opponent, whilst also stopping your opponent from implementing their primary game plan. Some of the most distinguishing cards in archetypes like this tend to be like the Armageddons and the Ravages of War, destroying all lands, because you're going to get early advantage with, a bunch of 1-drops, into 2-drops, into 3-drops, basically a curve tech, kind of like an aggro deck would do, and then drop an Armageddon to win. You are going to win with creature beatdown in a deck like this, but typically the reason that you do win is going to be because of your taxing effects, like Friendwing Mare, etc., that keep your opponent from essentially implementing their game plan, whilst you're operating generally about a turn to 2 turns slower than a typical aggressive deck would to actually win the game. So while RG Aggro or RG Blitz or Naya Blitz would tend to win, around turn 4, about turn 4 is pretty accurate. This deck will tend to win around turn 5 to 6. It can still fish out at 4, but typically through any disruption or blockers, you're going to have a more difficult time doing that. But you're also a lot less linear, and you have a lot more control lines, so you have a lot more range in how you can play the deck against varied matchups. So, this is actually, not this deck specifically, but White Weenie is one of the first decks that I built in any 100-card singleton format, not specific to Highlander, and it's also one of my favorite archetypes. I, have played it quite a bit, but unfortunately I've never done a VOD on it. I kind of want to cover this list that I put together because it has some distinguishing differences between itself and other lists that I've seen in the format to this point. What makes this deck different? Well, this deck's actually a little bit more of a beatdown deck. It's not the full Eldrazi and Taxes style list. Due to points changes, I believe it was in Strip Mine, the deck's no longer able to run Mine plus Soul Ring plus Crypt or Crypt Ring Mox. I can run all of those, but I can't run all of them together. This list is more focused on actually disrupting and using small creatures. So because I'm only running the Soul Ring as one of my points in the point spread, the deck is a little bit more focused on disrupting than it is beating down with stuff like, Eldrazi Displacer, Thought Not Seer, and Reality Smasher. So, that all said, guys, and I'm going to quit jumping around a little bit here in a moment. If you want to just watch gameplay, go ahead and jump down to the comment section. There'll be timestamps for each of the games that I play with this deck and showcase in this VOD. I'm going to do a fairly lengthy deck tech on this deck because, as I said, I think there are some distinguishing factors in this deck, and one of the distinguishing factors, or really the distinguishment that this deck kind of has over other decks of its nature, is that it's really trying to implement more of a value game plan, or it has more value lines that are available to it. And one of the things that I was really noticing is that there's been a lot of cards printed that are basically White Weenie, quote-unquote, cards, Death and Taxes cards, that have very powerful ETBs, whether they be, tutors, attack-based tutors, card draw, making more things, like 4 power for 3 is pretty good, getting rid of graveyards, getting rid of creatures, doing more of blinking. Making all of your creatures on the board, or not all of them, but making the smallest creature on your board a little bit bigger every time another creature enters the battlefield. Finding equipment, getting rid of artifacts or enchantments that are on the board, or exiling more cards from graveyards. There's a lot of cards that have these cool little incremental ETBs, and what I really want to do is, well, one, Fastbond got unrestricted, and in my mind, with Fastbond getting unrestricted, that's probably going to give a little bit of a boost to the land style archetypes that are in the format. I also tend to think that, decks like Jeskai are quite good in this format, and I wanted to have a deck that was capable of playing more at instant speed and also capable of salvaging either critical or semi-critical components on the board from point removal, aka like against Jeskai, and also had a pretty decent shot at attacking graveyard-based strategies like Storm and lands that are going to be using Loam or Yawgmoth's Will to be truly effective. So that's kind of where this build comes from. It's kind of what it's trying to do. And the real distinguishing card, and the card that I was like, I really want to play this card again, is Stonecloaker. Stonecloaker is a 3-mana 3/2 flash flyer. It does have a quote-unquote downside, which is you need to return a creature card to your hand. I mean, that could just be Stonecloaker if you play it with no creatures on the board. Or it could be any other random, value critter that you may have, or it could be saving any critter, like any of your just beat down critters, from the path of like a Lightning Helix or a Path or Plow, and then getting them back later. And if they're like one of these cards that are in this 12 pile right here, if it's like a Stoneforge Mystic, then you can, get your Umezawa's Jit plus your Sword of Fire and Ice if it's resolved twice. If it's a Recruit of the Guard, you get another free creature off of it from the creature you already got. Same with Ranger Captain of Eos. That's why you also have Restoration Angel. I don't think Restoration Angel is an uncommon one to see in these decks. But I really want to kind of exploit the value lines that were available to it to give it a little more range against the decks that are typically going to have in general more card advantage cards that they're capable of kind of leveraging, and then after they've leveraged their card advantage cards, they can start going 1-for-1 again with you, and it's eventually a trick you out to put you in a place where you're basically off the top of your deck every turn. And then win, but at the same time also have great lines for beating up on the decks that are not going to use the hand zone to amass their cards, but are going to typically use kind of an asymmetrical zone like the graveyard to drive value. So basically, build a Death and Taxes / White Weenie list that has the capability to dredge as much card advantage out of mono white cards as it possibly can, while still putting the opponent under a considerable clock to win the game. Now, I say considerable clock. It's going to be slower than like RG or Naya. It's not that fast. It's not Storm. It doesn't turn 3. But it can certainly disrupt before turn 3 to stop Storm-style decks. So you are losing speed when you play a deck like this, but what I think you gain is the ability to have a lot of range against a wide variety of other matchups. You'll kind of note that I'm down a land off the typical, Eldrazi and Texas list. Normally they play 34. I'm at 33 because I'm not playing the Eldrazi anymore. I don't have as many high CMC cards. I'm not running a Mana Crypt either. And the reason that I'm still running 33, because I think if you were to ostensibly just do an assessment of this deck and actually look at the converted mana cost, you could probably go down to 30, is that I want to have the flexibility to aggressively mulligan while still having lands in my 6 and 5 card hands to find the right cards that I need in a given matchup. So that's kind of why it's, at least is for me as a pilot and a builder, why you want a few more lands in Death and Taxes. I think oftentimes folks just accept some of the most prolific Death and Taxes pilots list as being correct, and they probably are very close to correct, is running 34 lands, and they never ask the question like, well, why does this deck that has the same mana curve as, let's say, RG or Naya, or has a slightly higher mana curve over RG, why does it run 7 more lands? And I do think the fundamental reason is that you want to be capable of mulliganing hands that don't do shit against other decks, because not all of your cards are replacement level. A Core Firewalker is not a Containment Priest, right? They're both 2/2s on their face, and they both do the same job of attacking, but they don't both fundamentally have the same disruptive effect. You want the Core Firewalker against like Blue-Red Moon or Mono-Red. And you want the Containment Priest against, Reanimator or any decks that are trying to pull shenanigans like Bamp Blink. It's very good against as well. So that's kind of why, you have the additional lands, so that your deck is enriched and you can mulligan to smaller and smaller hand sizes and still have a good expected value of having the correct volume of lands to operate as a curve-out deck with relevant hate pieces that will still also kill your opponent. Okay, so I'm going to break down how the piles are here. So I'm going to highlight them as I go. This is basically my mana pile that's being highlighted right now. This is an Ancient Tomb and City of Traders deck. We have Weathered Wayfarer to help find those if we desire them, and there's quite a few decent 2 colorless requirements in the deck, to include the equipment, to include the Armageddon, the Ravages, and then to include some of the critters themselves. A whole boatload of planes. We are an Aether Vial deck. Aether Vial, I think, tends to be very powerful in this deck, especially the more ETBs you get, and the more hate pieces you get. I think the more powerful Aether Vial gets. Aether Vial probably a little less powerful in like a strict White Weenie build. but still not horrendous. I mean, it also makes your stuff uncounterable, but really why you're using Aether Vial is because, one, you can keep a lesser land count in hand, because Aether Vial is going to essentially, quote-unquote, fix your mana, and allow you to play cards at instant speed, so that you can essentially exploit your opponent's play, or not provide them with maximum information to make play decisions during their main phases, based upon knowledge that they would have if you were casting the stuff on your main phase. And at the end of the day, it's just mana advantage. It's a consistent source of mana advantage. It's basically kind of like doubling cube for an aggressive attack deck, in a lot of ways. If you don't undergo typical mana progression, you can still use this thing to essentially undergo typical mana progression, and you're gonna have gas in hand. Eventually, you draw out of it, and then you start playing your small drops that you drew after you ticked up the vial, etc., etc. It's a very, very powerful card. I think in the more linear these decks get, I think the worse it gets, but I think in a deck like this, it's just fine. And when I say linear, I mean like the more you just play cards that have good stats. The more you're playing cards like, what's the card called? It's a 3-1 that becomes a 4-4 lifelinker with Exert. The more you're playing cards like that for 2, the more that you probably don't want Vial. But Vial's great in this list because we have so many disruptive elements, and I'll kind of get to those as we finish up the mana. Soul Ring. Playing Soul Ring, this is not going to be the fastest version of White Weenie, so I think Soul Ring is more appropriate than Mana Crypt is, because we don't want to take habitual damage off of our own mana. We're not going to be so quick that we can do that. And Soul Ring is just fine for, one, boosting us to basically turn 4 plays on turn 2, or even on turn 1 if you have one of the Moxen. Lotus Petal. Yep, card is great, and the reason we're running this is because of the points changes. I'm not running a Mox Pearl anymore. And I find that, even if you're not running a Mox Pearl anymore, the format's so quick that if you end up losing the die roll, it's still nice to have a Lotus Petal in your deck. You're down a card, but you've drawn a card for the turn, vice your opponent who was on the play. And this kind of allows you to retake the play as opposed to receiving the draw based on losing a die roll. And I think Lotus Petal is because of that reason, because of how quick the format is, very good. I think you want to have that option available to you. Chromox, same thing. It's unpointed, fast mana, and if you're on the draw, this card is great. If you're on the play, it's fine too, but generally speaking, you have these cards to kind of hedge against losing the play and having to take the draw. Next pile here is a utility land pile. Flysos of Troy here. This is probably one of the few decks. I suppose you could make a Selesnya Armageddon / Ravage's deck. That only this deck plays. But Flysos of Troy here. It's basically a plains legendary land. Whenever it is put to the graveyard from the battlefield, you search your library for a plains card. It can't be any plains card, so it doesn't have to be a basic. So if you're playing 2-color, you can get Scrubland with it, or Godless Shrine, etc. Card's very good, and it combines out very well with Ravages and Armageddon. Karakas, you can also combine it with Ghost Quarter. I've done that before. It doesn't pump you up on mana that very turn, but it does build up your mana base for the following turn, and it abates the loss of a card. Karakas, one of the best utility lands in the format. This card just smacks folks. When you get someone with this, you probably just win the game. If you can bounce a 2-drop legend like a JVP and they lose their whole turn cycle and you play a threat that same turn, you Karakas it, game's probably over. They're just behind so much and they've spent their mana to do nothing and they haven't interacted with your board at all. Alright, Silent Clearing. So these lands are awesome in this style of deck. This deck's not a pure aggro deck, so they're not at their best, but there are a ton of them that you can play in this because there are now three of these that make white mana. I'm not using the secondary color on Silent Clearing, Sunbaked Canyon, or Horizon Canopy, but the damage tends to be irrelevant because the deck is quick enough that it's oftentimes not a concern to take 2 to 3 damage off of your lands if need be. And the fact that they turn into we're a higher land count deck, and they turn into other cards later on in the game, tends to be really great, especially if you flood out. You also don't tend to want to have more than four lands in play on this deck. We only have one quote-unquote 5-drop, which is sort of Fire and Ice, which typically speaking is a 4-drop because you put it down with the Stoneforge Mystic and then equip it for 2. But oftentimes, if you do end up with these lands, you can play them out going over 4 lands and then just sack them on EOT or sack them during your turn to find more creature threats to kind of pressure your opponent out of the game and still stay at 4 so that when you Armageddon, you're not losing value. Ghost Quarter card's just very powerful. I'm actually not playing Leon and Arbiter right now because I have a lot of tutor effects in this deck, and I kind of encompass some of them in the value pile that I had on the other side. I also have, these are all tutors too. I mean, all these fetch lands are going to be tutors as well. But Ghost Quarter is still just very powerful. I do have Aven Mind Sensor, which does combine out well with Ghost Quarter, and the ability just to kill like a Tolarian Academy, or a Gaia's Cradle, or even a creature land, is very powerful. And even if they're replacing it with another land, like it's probably not going to be the same type of land. So this is generally going to be utility. But if you do combine it out with Aven Mind Sensor, you can just get folks, and it becomes a straight strip mine at that point in time. Next up, you have Rishadenport. This is probably one of the better decks for playing Rishadenport. It gets played in other decks as well. Not as often, though. But Rishadenport, it can't be understated how powerful this card is. In a deck like this, you can typically go off curve, get an early 1-drop down, go off curve on 2 to tap down one of their lands, screw up their whole turn cycle, play another 1-drop on turn 3 after your land drop, take them off of their 3 drops, and it basically can just time walk them habitually based upon their keep and the estimated theory of play for their keep. And the fact that it continually offers you as a pilot decisions on which colors you want to cut your opponent off of if they're not a monochromatic deck is also very big. Like Rishadenport may be, in my opinion, like one of I think it's one skill intensive. Like you need to understand how your opponent's deck works and what mana is going to be relevant to them based on turn cycle and based upon expected hidden holdings that they may have. But I think in some ways it's more powerful than Wasteland and Strip Mine because it offers you that continued flexibility of decision making over time. Now, yes, it comes at a cost of basically 2 mana, the Rishadenport plus another land, every turn cycle. But because this deck in general is fairly efficient, it tends not to be a cost that you mind paying as much if you're ensuring that they're not doing what they're intending to do, and you're continuing to progress the game state by beating them down with 1-drops or 2-drops. Wasteland, Strip Mine. Typically speaking, these are just going to be used for tempo in this style of deck. This deck's more on the aggressive end of things. It's an aggro control deck is what I would tend to call it. But typically speaking, you're just gonna fire these off right away just to keep your opponent from continuing to develop. You don't want them to really develop. You want to basically hinder their development as much as possible with these cards while still developing your own cards that have less resource requirements to actually get into play. You can save them for utility, and I have used them in the mid to late game. Once my opponent's already developed their mana, like I probably won't fire these off right away, but in the early to mid game, generally speaking, I'm firing them off just to preclude my opponent from actually developing further than where they're currently at. So next pile is all of my land tutors. So I do have the fetch lands and the Prismatic Vista and Weather Wayfarer in here. The fetch lands, you could make a debate that they are unnecessary in this deck, but I tend to find that I still kind of like having them. Like when you're playing against opposing Chase the Mind Sculptors and you're getting topped, they're kind of nice that way. If you get unexpectedly absented, they're kind of nice that way. So there's a few things that I find I tend to like having these for, and the fact that I can. In very small margins, then my deck is nice, and the fact that I can have an enriched mana base to enable greater flexibility in mulligan decisions, as I specified in the early part of this deck tag, is also kind of nice. Weather Wayfarer, I think this card is oftentimes underrated by folks and underplayed. This card's in the land tutor spot because that's what it does. Typically speaking, you have the ability to be down on lands. You have Wasteland, Strip Mine, you have Ghost Quarter, you have these not cycling lands, but sack lands to draw cards. So it's fairly easy to get behind on lands if you want to with this deck, and you don't need a ton to operate. You generally need less lands to operate than most other decks do. So it's not going to be hard to get to a point where Weather Wayfarer becomes relevant and you have less lands than your opponent. You're able to pay a white and tap this thing, this 1/1, to go ahead and go find any land in your deck. So this finds any land. So typically speaking, what you'll see, a standard progression with Weather Wayfarer is, you'll be in the draw, you'll play this out turn 1, they'll play their second land, do something. It'll go to your turn. You'll find generally Strip Mine or Rishadenport. Typically speaking, I like to find Rishadenport first. You won't be able to tie up their mana on that turn unless you have artifact mana that you played out earlier to develop. But basically, you go through all of your land destruction, screw up all of their mana base, screw up their mana base as much as possible, and then, go into like an Ancient Tomb or a City of Traders to basically all the turns you've taken off you've gotten them back with one card, with Ancient Tomb or City of Traders, and you're also generally at City of Traders first because I kind of want to have the ability to sack it so I can go back down on lands and keep on using Weathered Wayfarer to at that point probably get some of my some of my draw lands like Horizon Canopy, Sunbake Canyon, or Silent Clearing that I can again keep on using to provide myself mana to develop my board and attack them, and then also sack them off so I can keep on getting Weathered Wayfarer value. But oftentimes, if you get this card out early and you're against a more controlling or mid-rangey deck, you can either screw up their mana base or draw so much value out of your deck that that you can get up like 5 to 6 cards, and this card can really just get out of hand. And I think oftentimes, like, a lot of less experienced players don't understand how good this card is. Like, if you see this card come down and it's going to get value, generally speaking, you want to blow your path or your plow on it. Like, you just do. It doesn't look like that much, but it will over time just dredge a ton of cards out of a deck. And generally all of them are going to be pretty relevant. I mean, they're going to be as relevant as the pilot has built their deck to make them relevant. And in this case, I think we have enough, going on. Of note, it also gets Caracas, so it can get basically a kill spell or bounce spell for a creature on board that you need to deal with. Just does a whole hell of a lot. And I don't tend to see it as often. I don't tend to see this card as often anymore, and I think that is a mistake. I think this card is really good. But then again, I've also biased this build to be more value-oriented than attack-oriented. Now, it still attacks. It still attacks quite well. But it does give up some match percentiles against, like, red deck wins. I guess I should probably cover, like, why would you play Death and Taxes over playing White Weenie? The reason you would do it is because you want to have a deck, Death and Taxes, you want to have a deck like Death and Taxes that has greater range and greater match neutrality than a linear aggro deck. Now, why would you want to play the linear aggro deck? You'd rather play the linear aggro deck, the linear aggro White Weenie deck, because you know that your format is going to predominantly be aggressively based. White creatures are the best at fighting in combat. They are the best at killing shit. A lot of them have first strike, flying. They're just bigger for less mana. You just get more out of your card when you play white creatures, in my opinion. Like, they're just better creatures. I mean, like, for instance, like, Red Deck Wins has Zergo Bellstriker, and White Weenie gets Kithian. Red Deck Wins gets Jackal Pup, and, you get Savannah Lions. The cards are just better than other aggressive decks. I mean, even green, like, if you're not going, like, medium green, if you're going, like, just stompy, green stompy, like, your creatures are going to be better. They may eventually get bigger ones at the 3 spot, but your protective elements, your flying, your first strike is going to generally mean that even bigger critters have a difficult time attacking in while you use evasive threats to kill them off. So that's why you want to play White Weenie over Death and Taxes. But Death and Taxes in general is going to have greater range against more. It's also going to have the ability to disrupt to a much higher extent, whereas White Weenie is going to tend to just be like 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, Armageddon. That's their best draw. That's still going to be pretty good against most things. But if it's 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, and they go into 2-2-drops on turn 4, and they haven't done anything to interact with their opponent's game plan, that's the time frame you're getting hit in the face with tendrils for lethal, or you're getting high-tided out, or a moat's going to get played, and you're going to be like, well, shit, I wish I was playing Disenchanter, Leon, and Relic Warder. Intrinsically, they're worse cards at actually progressing the linear game plan, but they offer you more options against a lot more decks. So basically, Death and Taxes is a more mid-rangey, really, it's aggro control game plan of a pure aggro game plan. I think the base game plan is really just a White Weenie beatdown deck. But what really, I think, makes it novel in its kind of, its concept is that, it also seeks to control. And it controls through denial, so basically Sphere of Resistance style effects. In this case, not really Sphere of Resistance, but stuff like Thalia, stuff like, Aven Mind Sensor, could even be Kinjali's Sunwing, cards that make creatures come into play tap so that you're shutting down Kiki Pod lists, or you're, at a minimum, just buying enough time to attack through a bunch of tapped junk that your mid-range opponent's playing and just put them to dead on the following turn. So that's kind of the fundamental differences in the decks, and why I think you would play Death and Taxes. And to me, at least, and this is not, there's no hard and fast definition for this that I at least know of, or anything that's comprehensively defined in terms of Magic for calling this deck Death and Taxes, or any build Death and Taxes. Why you would play it, and really what it is. Like, it's a disruptive aggro control deck that, and what I call it is a control deck that beats down with its counter spells. That's kind of what I call it. I think that's probably the most elegant way of putting it, outside of all the words I just spewed at you. Alright, so anyways, that's all of our land, our mana base, and our mana manipulation. The next pile you have here is my Taxes cards, my pure Taxes cards. So you have Aven Mind Sensor. This card is just a bomb. Stops so much. Very good against combo. Flash speed, so it's decent against control. Decent sized body for the mana rate. I mean, you can do better nowadays, but the effect is fairly irreplaceable on this card. it's not irreplaceable. Like you have like Leonin Arbiter, which has a similar effect, although it is negatable. This is not. You have Shadow of Doubt, not playable in this build, and then you have like Mindlock Orb. But this card just gets so many folks. This is a card that folks either love or they hate, and I tend to be on the love side of it. I think it forces folks to play fair magic. When you're transmuting 5 things to do a combo, or even 2 things to do a combo, you're probably not doing fair magic. And if that gets disrupted, you pretty much have to accept that, hey, it just didn't work out this time, And that's kind of what Even Monster does. It says, hey, we're going to play face up, we're going to play straight up magic. If you can't beat me in straight up magic, well, sorry, you're going to die to this 2-1. Kajali Sunwing, this is just a card that tends to, in general, be good against creature-based combo. It's also a decent-sized body for the rate. Having 3 toughness, having more than 2 toughness is becoming more and more relevant. The faster and faster the format gets, what happens is a lot of the aggressive decks lean out, become more efficient, play more X1s for 1 and 2 mana, and play less 3 and 4 drops. So, like, Red Deck Wins basically plays 1 to 0 4 drops now. Like the Sui Black deck that I've showcased plays 0 4 drops. I mean, I think it has 1 4 drop. It's the demon that it's basically a 3 drop with Spectacle. That said, the reason that that's relevant is because a lot of decks that are looking to control or mid-rangey have a lot more cards like Fire Ice, Electrolyze, Forked Bolt, Arc Trail. I think I already said Fire Ice. Cards of those ilk that will distribute damage across multiple sources. And if you have a lot of 2 and 1 toughness things, those cards can either kill 1 or kill multiple cards. And when you start getting to 3 toughness, like basically get out of the shock range, I tend to think that gives you a little more equity in your cards actually sticking around. So, good sized body, good toughness on it, flies, which flying tends to be really relevant. I mean, like, it sounds stupid to say, flying and First Strike are great. Like, flying and First Strike win combat. And that's kind of why I was saying in the beginning, like, white creatures are just the best. Like, they just have the best creatures, like, the best little creatures. Thalia Heretic Cathar, this card just slaps. It's a big body. Yeah, obviously doesn't bypass the shock test, but against multi-killer decks, it slows down their development by a whole turn cycle. Basically gives you multiple time walks. Brings all their creatures in tapped, so they can't block. You can keep on attacking for an extra turn. Gets you time walk that way. So basically, it hinders their development, and it also buys you attack steps. So this card is just sick. It beats up on aggro, beats up on mid-range. Against combo, it really, hopefully, just disrupts their mana, but generally speaking, it's not going to be as great there. Vryn Wingmare. This card is weak. It's a 2-1 for 3 that flies. And it says non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. This is kind of a flex spot card. I put this in because I kind of wanted to beat up on like the Storm or the Eggs or the like Tolarian Academy style decks. I don't know if it really per se gets after that as much. I think maybe I just need like a hard and fast answer to like artifact style decks. And I really don't think that that's God, I can't think of it right now. The Spirit, Kataki the War's Wage. I don't think it's that card. It may just straight up be like this deck wants to run a Stony Silence, or maybe there's the ability to actually just throw a Stony Silence in this deck. Or another option is like one of the serious things I've been debating on like the Death and Taxes builds. Like white black has been built, but I think there may actually be a white green variant of the deck that uses Collector Oof. Uses Night of Autumn, could possibly run Rexage, runs Gaddock Teague. Well, Gaddock Teague's a little dicey because I have the 2 Planeswalkers plus the 2 Geddons that I'm risking a little bit. Kasali Pride Mage, Voice of Resurgence, you name it. There's a lot of good like white-green cards that are actually really taxy, and at this point, like I'm not really as happy with Vryn Wingmare. I don't see Storm as much, but I do like this effect. It's essentially like having a second Thalia. It does fly, which means that against the creature decks, typically speaking, it's going to be difficult to block, and I can keep on chipping in for damage. Over the course of a game, it locks up with equipment better because of flying. That's why I ended up putting this card in there. At one point, I believe it had been Hushwing Griff, but I ended up taking that out because I found that I had a lot of ETBs that I actually really cared about that I did not want to turn off with Hushwing Griff. So I ended up putting this card in to kind of give me a little bit more range against like the combo decks. If there's anything I could say this specific build is likely weak against, I think it is like Academy-style decks right now. I don't think I have it set up in the best way to really exploit that matchup, especially their faster draws. I think I only have a couple like real like bullet cards that kind of just get them, which we'll go over in a bit. Gideon the Trials, definitely a tax card. Doesn't look like it. This card just pounds. It pounds, kills people dead. It protects itself. It kills them by becoming a 4/4, and you can make an emblem that says as long as you have a Planeswalker, a Gideon Planeswalker, can't lose the game. So basically, against Storm, you just put an emblem out, and if they have to bounce this card, and then they have to Storm off to kill you, which is pretty good. Hollow Spirit Keeper, just wrath-proofing. I consider this kind of a tax effect because, it either kills you or you blow it up and it becomes 4 to 5, 1/1s, and that tends not to be good. You can also exile it, but that requires specific answers. Containment Priest just stops graveyard-based and creature-based strategies. So this basically stops Pod, flat in its tracks, stops Eldritch Evolution, Green Sun Zenith, Finale of Devastation, the new single time Pod, the blue-green card. I cannot remember the card's name right now, but the one that puts a +1/+1 counter on the thing you find, it's 1 converted mana cost up. That's Natural Order, stops a lot of different stuff. Stops Reanimator as well, which I haven't seen a lot of, but, I think the card is just solid enough. One, it's a flash creature, so you can play it at flash speed and kind of surprise someone, force them to counter on the end step, or at least have a 2-power body down to attack them with. Just, it does enough in enough matchups that I think it's quite good. Imposing Sovereign. I just really appreciate this effect. The ability to have creatures come into the battlefield tapped means our opponent's creatures come into the battlefield tapped is very powerful in my opinion, and this will oftentimes just stymie another aggressive deck enough, especially if you're on the play, that they're not going to block enough of your damage out to prevent you from just attacking them every single turn until they're dead. And it's also just a human. I think this is the only creature that is solely a human and has no other profession, just human. Our Remorseful Cleric, this is also a hate card. This card is more specific to hating out just graveyards en masse. I believe they just printed a new 2-mana, white and 1, 2/1 protection from black that you can pay 2 to exile a target card from a graveyard. That card is interesting. I don't think it's quite as powerful as Remorseful Cleric, because Remorseful Cleric can come out immediately and have that effect. It also flies, which I think flying is actually better than protection from black. But the fact that you can just save this thing and do it at any time, and you can do it the turn it comes into play, is really kind of what sold me on this card, or what sells me on this card. And the fact that it has flying. Flying is really big. You just attack over the top of big, dumb green idiots, with your shit or with your sword, and it doesn't matter. You can race them, and block with your first strikers, and kill big things with 2 to 3 first strikers, quad blocking or triple blocking or double blocking. I just think this is a really strong card. I think it doesn't see enough play. And really, the big sell on it was I figured that Loam was going to be much bigger in the metagame after the unpointing of Fastbond. I have played that matchup a couple times. I haven't seen it as much as I expected to see it online. But Remorseful Cleric does kind of stop Loam shenanigans, so it's pretty good. Selfless Spirit, again, just wrath-proofing. Can't stop a T-Del, but it definitely stops, Day of Judgments, Wrath of God, Supreme Verdicts. Does not stop Terminus. Although at this point I'm kind of starting to think that maybe cards like this are becoming a little bit outmoded. Selfless Spirit, you don't tend to see the standard type wraths anymore. The ones that I tend to see are the Dead of Winter, Toxic Deluge, Terminus, and cards along those lines. That said, you can still just sack this thing to protect a critical component in your deck, a critical creature that you need to hose the matchup you're in. We were just talking about Academy. Spirited Labyrinth is one of my strongest cards against Academy. I really like this card against the draw 7s, against decks that need to kind of fish around to find answers. Also a decent clock against most decks. This card's very powerful. It does kind of hose a couple of the cards that I have. It stops the Monarchy from working off of... Where are you at, buddy? Probably over here in the value pile. Palace Jailer stops the Monarchy from drawing you cards, and your opponent as well if they steal it. Ends up stopping, where are you at? Smuggler's Copter from drawing cards, and then it stops our Sword of Fire and Ice from drawing cards. So it does have some downside as well against us, but in general, when you have this card, one, it's a clocks, it's going to end the game faster if they don't kill it, and two, in the right matchups, it hoses them much worse. Stops their Brainstorms, their Ancestral Recalls, their Chase the Mind Sculptors, you name it. Thalia Guard of Thraben, this is just a combo killing card, and it's played in Legacy, Death and Taxes. It's just very good, and I've talked this card a bunch in a bunch of different VODs, so I'm not going to go and talk it. If you haven't played with Thalia Guardian of Thraben, she's great in small creature decks. She definitely stops a lot of bullshit from happening. Tithe Taker. Great card. So initially I wasn't sure if I was sold on this card, and the more I've played with it, the more happy I've kind of become with it. It's not a great rate. It's 2 mana for a Piker, which is not great, but it's fine. It's acceptable. So really the way I was first assessing this card is based on like your opponent casting spells, but it's actually abilities as well, which means that like fetch lands can't be fetched on your turn, which, and I'm not saying like you should play in a way that, or expect that your opponents will play in a way that's not optimal, but a lot of folks forget about that and they'll be like, oh shit, I can't fetch anymore because they have to pay for it. It also stops spells. It stops stuff like Grim Lavamancer on your turn if they haven't left up a bazillion mana to kind of do that, plus cast their other relevant spell. It does enough against enough things that I've found this to be very powerful. The other selling point, and I don't know if that would be good enough for me to run it, but the fact that when it dies, it comes back as a 1/1 flyer is also just great. Like it just keeps on giving. Like it's hard to kill it. You have to exile it if you want to not have a 1/1 come into play. And I think oftentimes if you're exiling a 2-mana 2/1, like you're probably not exactly where you want to be. But card's great. Core Firewalker and Silver Knight, I'll cover kind of both these at once. These are kind of like incidental hoser cards against red deck wins, but the biggest reason they're in here is because red removal is very heavy right now. So, because most of the creature-based or the aggressive-based strategies have had to kind of go lower to the ground to combat the fastest combo decks, be as fast as the fastest combo decks or faster, and definitely more consistent. A lot of the removal has also shifted to be less mana-intensive and a little more specific. For instance, like the burn spells, I guess is what I'm saying, are more common removal. And you'll obviously see that in red deck wins. You'll see it in blue-red. You see it in Jeskai. And I think Core Firewalker and Silver Knight are very great cards against those decks because they're not irrelevant bodies, and they're just very difficult to remove. Or you're spending premium removal like Swords to Plowshares or Path to Exile on them, which I think is just fine. Like you're pretty happy to get that exchange rate, and then they save their burn for something else. But the likelihood of them having it's a lot lower than having one of 7 burn spells they're running in their deck as opposed to the 2 hard removal spells they have. Samurai the Pale Curtain, again, this just kind of houses, any lands that are going to be used in the lands-based strategies with Fastbond, Loam are going to get exiled, and this card does that. It houses graveyards, right? And that's kind of what, like I said, is one of the sub-themes of this deck, is that I really wanted to have cards to kind of house decks that use the graveyard as a zone for value and for card advantage. And Samurai the Pale Curtain certainly does that, and it's good in fighting. It's good at fighting. It's got Bushido, so if it gets blocked, it's 3/3. And attacks is fine. Phyrexian Revoker, this is just a pretty common lock piece that you see in most Death and Taxes builds in Legacy. It's a vintage staple I wouldn't say a vintage staple, but an archetype staple in Vintage for Shop's List. It just shuts any given thing down that you think is going to be relevant for your opponent. That may be a Charbelcher, it may be a certain Planeswalker, basically anything that's not a land. Judge's Familiar, just a flyer, an efficient flyer that also you can sacrifice to stop instants and sorceries. I've definitely used this to win games against Storm, or at least force them off their mana efficiency such that they would have to go to the next turn to win, at which point in time I attack them for lethal, so they don't get that extra turn. Very good against them. Same with Dryad Militant. This card just houses Storm decks. Like, this is one of the worst cards for them to see turn 1. You're just like, Dryad Militant. And it basically shuts off their entire Yawgmoth's Will line, which that deck is a Yawgmoth's Will deck. Like, typically you're going to expend your tutors, the first go around to find all the setup pieces. Generally adds Black Lotus and fast mana into, a Yawg Will or an Ill-Gotten Gains, and to redo all of it again, find the Yawgmoth's Will if you found the Ill-Gotten Gains, redo it all again, building the Storm up to about 8, tutoring twice to find, maybe some more fast mana and a Tendrils, and then getting them with Tendrils, but none of that's possible if they don't have a graveyard built up, so the deck is very dependent upon their graveyard zone, and Dryad Militant just kind of hoses that. It has incidental value against Delve decks, decks that are going to use their spells to build up essentially a virtual mana resource in their graveyard to cast down Gurmag Anglers, Tombstalkers, Hooting Mandrills, etc., and Dryad Militant just kind of gets that as well. So this card's pretty strong. Obviously some of these cards, do fall into the realm of cards that are also frail to like the Arc Trail and the Forked Bolt type effects, Electrolyze, Fire Ice, and this is certainly one of them. And that's a hazard of the business, I suppose you'd have to say, like, is that folks are going to be playing those kind of cards, and sometimes your cards are just to be gotten by them. But you have to assume that this card does enough in a lot of other matchups that it's worth the trade-off. Relic of Progenitus, yep, playing this thing. I wanted, another answer to graveyards. This one cycles itself, draws another card, and is a consistent source of annoyance for graveyard-based strategies. So again, very very heavy on attacking the graveyard zone. But the fact that this draws a card, even though the rest of my graveyard hate attacks, so it actually actively kills them, this card does not. But it does cycle itself, so I thought it was acceptable. And in general, I don't care that heavily about my graveyard. The card that probably most cares about is like Hallowed Spirit Keeper, but I can live without my graveyard. This next pile is my pure beatdown, my basically pure beatdown cards. You have Mutavault, Mishra's Factory, two lands that I did not cover in the land section. Basically, they're lands that become attackers. Elspeth Knight of Ront, just very good. Acts as essentially a haste creature for 3 power evasion. Can, kind of just attrit them out with 1/1s and eventually make all your stuff indestructible. I don't think I ever use that ability in this deck. It'd be very rare that I would. I don't think I have in years. Maybe in years past I've used that ability when the cards were just a lot worse and the games were more attritional, but the games tend to be more, a little more linear in their progression that I play now. Alright, Gideon Ally of Zendikar. Yep. Again, just kind of like a better Elspeth. Basically 7 power for 4. It's just a big dude. Or it can be an Anthem. Brightly, this card could go into the Taxes pile. It's a very mana-intensive card, but it's like if you're not playing against a permission-style deck, this card's very hard to kill. It's very hard to race. It lifelinks. It has Vigilance. You can return it to your hand, recast it. If you have Vial, it gets gross with Vial. It's tough for Control to kill this thing because you just bounce it back to your hand, replay it. If you're using Vial to do that, it can just get really, really gross. So, very powerful card, Brightling that is. Kind of slow, but also very resilient. So I think the card itself is definitely worth the include. But not the strongest either. But just, relatively good against Control, good in mid-range, actually very good against like Red Deck wins because it's just hard as hell to kill. They have to generally tend to try to out-tempo you, like throw a burn spell, waste a burn spell trying to get you to bounce this thing, you bounce it, they hit you for a bunch, you replay it, and they have to have another burn spell, and then generally you'd be dead, but if they don't, then you just block, make it a 2/4 and give lifelink to it, and then just kill them, and then kill that thing, gain some life, and then, start basically taking command of the game. Burmaz, this guy's just huge. He dies to Caracas, but he's just big. He's a 3/4 for 3 with Vigilance, so he's very hard to race. He makes 1/1s when he attacks. He makes 1/1s when he blocks. He kind of just does it all. Mirran Crusader, this card just randomly houses some decks. It gives you a lot more match percents against like the mid-range Golgari decks, mid-range green decks, any decks that run green threats. Very difficult to block. Is essentially a 4-power 3/3. If you put any equipment on him, he basically ends the game in about a hit. Silverblade Paladin, kind of same thing. We are playing equipment in this list. We do have ways to buff our team. You put this on a 3 or 4 power creature, and you're looking to kill your opponent right away. Essentially acts as haste damage when you play it, and soul bond it with a creature that's currently on the board, especially one that's already equipped, or one that you buff up with your Elspeth Knight of Ront, or your Gideon, or whatever. But this card just kills quickly. Knight of the Holy Nimbus, this could also kind of be a taxi card against like the controlling decks. If you're not familiar, 2 mana, 2/2 for double white, flanking. So flanking gives every creature card that blocks this card -1/-1. So technically this card cannot be, not technically, it cannot be blocked by, it can be blocked by True Name Nemesis, but it actually kills True Name Nemesis, because flanking is not a targeted effect, it's a triggered ability. If it be destroyed, regenerated. So your opponent has to pay 2 to actually get rid of this thing if they're going to kill it through traditional means like damage. If they exile it, like Swords of Plowshares, Path to Exile, work on Knight of the Holy Nimbus, but otherwise it's a very tough threat to kill. You can't Wrath it, and if you Wrath it, you have to generally play a 4-mana Wrath, then pay 2 to kill this thing. If it's a Little Wrath of God, it just kills it, because that says it can't be regenerated. But, you know what I mean. Supreme Verdict, Day of Judgment. Smuggler's Copter. So, card advantage. 2 mana 3/3 flyer. This card is absurd. It should almost be in every aggressive deck. Every aggressive deck that plays creatures should play this card. This card is just that good. It was banned for a reason. This is just an effect that should not really be available to aggressive decks, but it is, so we play it. Dauntless Bodyguard. This could also go in the tax pile. Kind of has a weird effect. Typically what you're going to do, if you only can play this thing on turn 1, this is the only 1-drop you have, you're going to play it turn 1, but if it's not turn 1, then you'll play this out to protect your most relevant hate piece. That may be Athalia, Guardian of Thraben. It may be, I don't know, Containment Priest. Who knows? The fact that it can keep your most relevant hate piece alive is kind of what makes it great. But it's also just great because it's a 2-mana 1/1. Or, I'm sorry, it's a 1-mana 2/1. Occasion Javelineers. This one's a little more questionable. Old Fallen Empires card with this sweet promo art on it. So when it enters the battlefield, it gets a javelin counter on it. You can tap it to do 1 damage to any target, and be player, creature. This card is very good in aggressive matchups, and actually you could move this over here into this pile, like the value pile, because you could actually resto this and put another counter back on it. I really like this card against like red decks. If you get to untap with it, you can generally just kill their Jackal Pup. And it's great. Like you still have a 1/1 left, and it can block to kill like maybe 15 to 20% of their threats that attack you. This card is just fine. Like I think this card's actually a lot better than folks kind of give it credit for, and I'm trying it right now. Like I think the card, has the ability as a 1-mana card to actually accrue you card advantage. And in the Modo meta right now, there are a lot more like aggressive and mid-range decks. So I tend to really like Acacian Javelineers in the metagame that is online right now. Now I think if I were to go to like YJ and play against a bunch of combo and like a bunch of G-Gen nonsense, I would take Acacian Javelineers out and probably just put in a better beater, like a up 2/1 for 1, over Acacian Javelineers. Or I'd look to play another tax card. Like if I knew the meta, I would probably put in like something that like attacked the best combination decks that I expected to see, or possibly another hate piece for Tolarian Academy. But this card's very good in aggressive matchups, aggressive mirror matches. It just knocks out small dudes for basically free. And you can blink it, with Stone Cloaker or with Restoration Angel and get another counter on it and do it again if you really want to. But I'm going to put it over here in the beaters, but it kind of does have the ability to also be a value card. Alright, Ismaru, yep, just a big 2/2 for 1. Kithian, probably the best attacking 1-drop in white. Mother of Runes is probably the best 1-drop in white. Weather Wayfarer is also up there, for me at least. I think Weather Wayfarer is sick. But Kithian's probably the best beatdown 1-drop. Definitely the best 2/1 for 1 in white. Legion's Landing, very powerful as well. I ended up adding this card because, I wanted the ability to have like a way to just trid out other aggressive decks or generate a problem permanent for control decks to beat. If you flip this thing against control, especially like hard control, they're going to generally have a tougher time dealing with it because it's just going to keep on adding up. It's basically like the old school. Gosh, I can't think of it, guys. Not Korhaven. Oof, it's going to come to me later, but there's an old card, Kaljoran Outpost, that you play Sack of Plains. When it comes to play, I believe it's untapped planes, but it may not be an untapped planes. No, it's not untapped, so you can tap the planes. You Sack of Plains when Kaljoran Outpost comes to play. Tap 2 plus Kaljoran, tap white 1 plus Kaljoran Outpost, so 3 mana, basically, to make a 1/1 soldier token. I don't remember if it has vigilance. No, it doesn't have vigilance. So basically that was like a control mirror breaker back in the day, and this card kind of does that. And it's also it gives life-linking dudes, which is better. So it allows you to kind of race against more aggressive decks as well, with basically a source of card advantage that does not cost you cards. So pretty good. I like the card a lot. Sky Marcher Aspirant. Yeah, it's a 2/1. It's on the low end of my 2/1s, but it clocks. It puts a clock on them, and it can eventually have flying, which is pretty good. Soldier of the Pantheon, pretty good. Protection from Multicolor is not irrelevant. It protects it from Kitchen Finks, Figure of Destiny, Abrupt Decay, Assassin's Trophy, Electrolyze. It makes this card a little bit harder. Is it Charm? Makes this card a little bit harder to deal with. Gains you some random incremental life against certain decks. And yeah, so that buys you time, and it also just attacks pretty well. Removal piles next. You have Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile, pretty standard. Disenchant, which is not as standard, but I think probably something you want in this. I've considered running Fragmentize as well, but Fragmentize, while it does pretty much everything I would want it to do, is not an instant. That's the only difference. This is not an instant, so I'm playing this cool Heather Hudson Disenchant art that costs 2 mana as opposed to 1, and can react at instant speed. Declaration of Stone, this card is beast. The reason I kind of like running a card like this still is because it can deal with tokens. Tokens can be problematic. Like cards like Elsbeth Sun's Champion or like Bitter Blossom can just put a damper on things for this deck, especially if they kind of get out of hand and you're not able to pressure them early. And this allows you to just kind of mop all that bullshit up and attack them for a significant chunk of damage and put them far enough back that you can attack in again and kill them on the following turn if they're not able to deal with the board. Council's Judgment kills anything, just very good, and it's untargeted, so it can get rid of True Name Nemesis, etc. Unexpectedly Absent, I love this card. This is like Memory Lapse for this deck. It's like basically a more tempo-oriented Memory Lapse. I generally tend to only spend 2 mana on this. I don't normally spend more than 2 mana on it, 2 white mana, just to put a card directly on top. Generally, it's a mana dork or something like that in the mid game, because I'll tell you what someone does not want to be doing when they're playing a deck that runs mana dorks or runs acceleration. They don't want to be recasting it on turn 3 or turn 4. They don't want to be drawing it on turn 3 or turn 4 either. So when you force them to do it, it generally tends to just be a time walk, especially if you've been putting down 1 and 2 drops and applying pressure. Ravages and Armageddon, these tend to be the most powerful cards in this deck, in this archetype, really. These tend to be the pretty quintessential 4-drops, the ideal draws for this deck, at least in a more aggressive mindset, or looking at it more aggressively. It's going to be 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, Armageddon, win. And yeah, you like to blow up lands. It's good for you. Giver of Runes, Mother of Runes, Harm's Way, Brave the Elements. Basically kind of like sneaky tax cards that protect your creatures, protect your most relevant creatures, allow you to attack through for a ton of damage, allow you to 2-for-1, prevent damage and 2-for-1 your opponent in aggressive mirrors or in mid-range mirrors. Mother of Runes, Giver of Runes, just, push through damage or protect critical elements, force 2-for-1s out of your opponent. The equipment package, so Steel Shaper's Gift, Umezawa's Jit, and Sword of Fire and Ice. These are all tutor package cards to work with Stoneforge Mystic, as well as Steel Shaper's Gift, and basically bolster your game plan against, Jeskai in the case of Sword of Fire and Ice, allows you to attack through True Name Nemesis, as well as opposing aggro matchups and mid-range matchups with Umezawa's Jite, which is just a fair and balanced Magic card. So this pile here we kind of covered as the distinguishing pile for like this specific build. Like I'm running Inoffensive Kintree Spirit because I want to have more options. I want to have more options with ETBs in this deck, based around the inclusion of Stonecloaker and Restoration Angel, which is probably not as novel as Stonecloaker. And these cards, this card does that. It allows creatures entering or leaving and re-entering the battlefield to actually be of some value to you and actually promote your primary game plan, which is attacking them to death. I recognize that I'm accepting a little bit of risk because I'm running a 2-drop legendary creature that can get bounced. With Caracas, it's kind of weak on its own. It's just a 2/2 bear. But it does accrue a lot of value over a game. If you have this thing out for 2 to 3 turns, like generally speaking, you're going to win. Resto Angel, buys back any effect that I may want, and with an increased ETB count in the deck, this card's value goes up significantly, and it can also just save a relevant threat that you have on the board from dying. Palace Jailer, if this thing resolves and you're on an open board, you're probably winning. Stonecloaker, this is one of the ones I was talking about earlier. This card is older, and it's a time-shifted card. It's pretty cool. It doesn't see as much play, but it incidentally hits graveyards for whatever reason. Safeguards, threats that are possibly going to get removed. Buys back, Blade Splicers or, Palace Jailers to do it all over again. And it's just a good relevant threat. It's a 3/2, for 3 that flies and has flash. So it's pretty easy. I think it's pretty easy to include. You don't see it as often. But I think the card's very powerful. And I think it becomes more powerful the more often that you're seeing aggressive or mid-range matchups where your opponent's going to have point removal. And also in builds where you have more cards that have relevant ETBs, whether they be making 4 power with like Blade Splice, the next card here, which is just a ton of power for not a lot of mana, and it's castable off Ancient Tomb, save with Stonecloaker, Ancient Tomb mana, nice. 3-Man Inspector, gets you cards, is what it does at the end of the day. It's a 1/2, it's a Squire, but it gets you a free card when you have the mana to sink into it. Relic Seeker needs to have hit them first, but this card has a relevant ability that can be rebought, essentially, or can be reacquired by Stonecloakering it or Resto Angeling it to get it back. It needs to hit them again, but it's still pretty good. Recruit of the Guard, and Ranger Captain of Eos. Ranger Captain of Eos, these cards are both great because they're going to get you free cards. Ranger Captain of Eos is great because it can basically stop you from Wrath of Godding, or stop your opponent from Wrath of Godding, or stop them from doing whatever obnoxious combo they're going to do on their next turn and kill you so that you can get the turn pass back to you and you can kill them. Stoneforge Mystic, don't really need to explain this card. It just wins games. It gets you your 2 pieces of equipment. If you get to flash it or blink it, or buy it back with like the Stonecloaker or the Resto Angel, you can get both pieces. Pretty good. Leona Relic Warder just deals with artifacts and enchantments. I don't have a ton of this in right now, and I could possibly use more, but this is another one of my point removal spells for enchantments and artifacts on top of the disenchant that I currently have, and the Unexpectedly Absent and Council's Judgment. Mardu War Reaper, you can also blink this guy and just exile a creature card from a graveyard if you need to. Not the most powerful use of blinking, but it does have an ETB that is not irrelevant in the deck as well. So anyways, guys, that is the deck. As I kind of specified, it's a deck that is heavily set upon kind of trying to beset the decks that got better because of Fastbond going to 0. was kind of the concept behind it, with a kind of a side of enters the battlefield style effects that I felt were best augmented by having more cards that buy cards back, like Stonecloaker, which promotes the graveyard hate kind of synergy that I wanted in the deck. So basically, I'm trying to kind of get to a point where I'm building like essentially like White Jund, where like I can play this kind of like, you know, curve out aggro game plan with slightly suboptimal threats that also kind of have the out to going long and driving a ton of value out of my cards, and basically running them out of cards while I am going up on cards at the same time. Kind of the concept and theory behind it. It also has the death and taxes thing going on, so it can hate a lot of stuff out. And the deck's been pretty successful. I think I played about 12 games with this. I think I played 3 leagues, and I think I went 4-0 in all 3 leagues. It was either 2 leagues or 3 leagues, but I went 4-0 with this deck in at least 2 leagues, but I think it was 3 leagues. So the deck has worked out well for me. You know, some of the pairings were good, but I've also had some hard matchups. I think I played Academy once and got a little lucky against them. But anyways, guys, I'm going to go on a quick pause, and I will be back momentarily to cover some gameplay with this build of Death and Taxes. Hey guys, Loam02 back again. So we'll be playing some, going through some gameplay of Death and Taxes. I'm playing against Wolfgang Cloud here. Tends to be an aggressive player. Generally, red deck wins. This hand's acceptable. I mean, it has some range against red deck wins. It's a little threat light. Relic of Progenitus is not really what you want to see. And Declaration Stone is a little bit slow. And hopefully the game will play. Okay, unfortunately, guys, it looks like Modo's been sitting on for too long. I actually had to take a decently long break here, and it's been sitting on for a bit. So I'm going to try to restart Modo. I'm going to pause this, and we'll come back to this game and see if we can capture this first game that I intend on highlighting. Back momentarily. Alrighty, folks, back in. Moment of truth. Let's see if this game will play out. So this is the hand. I believe I do end up keeping this in the dark, and let's see if the replay will kick off, or if it'll freeze up. Well, it looks like, unfortunately, it's going to freeze up. So quick pause, guys. I'm going to try to do this one more time, and then we'll possibly jump to some more games. All right, guys, back. Let's see if this replay will work. Well, unfortunately, it appears replays may be having issues right now. All right, yeah, it went through a mulligan decision and then just froze up. So, quick pause. I'm going to try to get some other replays working. I'm going to test them before I jump into another one again and have more video length of me just showing you keepable or unkeepable hands and mulligan decisions with the deck, and we'll see if we can get back for some more gameplay. Well, guys, sorry about this. I've tried multiple different replays to include newer ones that are inside my annals of Modo and my replays, but unfortunately, currently, they are not operating. So what I'm going to try to do is this. I'm assuming there's probably some sort of issue with Modo involving replays that will likely get fixed or will absolve itself over the next 24 to 48 hours, and I'll conduct a secondary release, or I guess publication, whatever you want to call it, video that actually has some of the gameplay from this deck, but I'm going to post this as an independent film or independent VOD that goes over the deck tech and theory of play of this list. You kind of get a separate look at the deck here, and you get to see its curve. You know, pretty nice, aggressive-looking curve, but we also got to cover kind of some of the different functionalities that the deck has built into it, and some of the theories of build that I think make this build distinguishable from others that are currently out there. And if not, I mean, there are probably other builds that try to encapsulate more value-oriented lines. I do think this build, you know, at least deliberately in theory of build, probably does so more deliberately than those other decks do, or other builds of Death and Taxes do. And so far, the deck has been pretty successful. Like I said, right now I think it's 12-0 in league play, and you know it's had a good winning percentage outside of league play as well in the testing that I did with it. One of my favorite archetypes. You know, I think there are other players that in the Canadian Highlander, the YJ Victoria community that have probably more experience on it than I do, and possibly some different things to say. And hopefully, you know, there's enough good value in this content as well as the stuff that they put out there that if this is an archetype that interests you, you know, you can get kind of involved in it. A little bit more expensive to get involved directly into Death and Taxes specifically. However, I do think that White Weenie is a great launching point into this archetype. It gives you a lot of the cards that you kind of need to build towards Death and Taxes. And over time, you know, you can get to a point where it's a much more affordable deck. Obviously, in some varieties, you're going to want to play Mox Pearl. It's nice to have access to the Mox Pearl, which is going to be the singularly most expensive card that you're going to end up running in a deck like this. But on the whole, most of the cards are fairly inexpensive. You know, I think Caracas, I mean, if you don't want an original print Caracas, you'll be fine. But for the most part, most of them are fairly reasonable, and the deck is very powerful and has range to fight against a lot of different things that are in the format. And I think a build like this specifically is straddled enough that it has some game also against like Jeskai mid-range. Where you assume a little risk is like the medium style decks, I think, will tend to kind of overrun this deck, for better or worse, but you have some decent answers like Disenchant and stuff that taps their creatures down to kind of allow you to race those things. But typically the deck will struggle with 5-drop into 5-drop into 5-drop. That's kind of tough, but that also involves their best starts. Anyways, guys, hope you enjoyed the video, and I apologize again for the lack of gameplay that is coming with this video, but I hope in general the deck tech and theory of play is at least helpful, and you trust the numbers that I've given you, that the deck has been successful in the metagame online, which, it did include playing against some Tolarian Academy decks, did involve playing, I believe, against Storm once, but primarily was against aggressive mid-range strategies and a couple control, probably quarter control decks were kind of the matchups that this deck had to go through. So it's been through a decent range of all matchups available. Probably less combo than you'd expect in the most competitive metagames, the most degenerate and best players. Which is where this deck I think would really be put to the test. But it did well, at least in the MTGO online league meta. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video content. I'm going to cut it here, and like I said, if the replays start working again, I will put up content on it. But it's the middle of the day, and I have other stuff going on. I'm not going to try to jump around trying to get games to put on the VOD right now with live play. All right, guys, enjoy, and take care now.